let's talk about one of the most incredible stories in modern art. We're going to trace the wild journey of street art, how it went from being spray painted on city walls, something you'd get arrested for, all the way to the auction blocks at places like Sotheby's. Okay, let's get into it.
This was the big question, right? The central conflict that kicked everything off. For a lot of people, it was just a crime, plain and simple, defacing public property. But for the artists themselves, it was their voice. It was a statement, a way for a generation to scream, "We are here," and demand to be seen.
So, how did they do it? How did they go from outlaws to art world royalty? Well, that's exactly what this explainer is all about. We're going to follow that incredible path of rebellion, pure creativity, and ultimately the transformation that took this art form from the underground right into the mainstream. To understand this, we have to go back in time. Picture it. 1970s New York City. It was gritty. It was energetic. It was, well, kind of chaotic. And the city itself became this massive concrete canvas for a whole new generation of artists who really just had a can of spray paint and something to say. It all started with something super simple, the tag. A tag is basically a stylized signature. It was the first, most basic way for an artist to make their mark, to claim territory, and to get their name out there. Back in 1971, a kid who wrote Techie 183 became an absolute legend. His name was everywhere, turning subway cars and brick walls into his own personal gallery. But, artists are never going to stick with the basics for long. Tags started to evolve. Fueled by the rise of hip-hop, artists formed crews, and they started working together on these huge, elaborate pieces. And that gave birth to wild style, this super complex, almost unreadable style of interlocking letters that turned entire train cars into rolling masterpieces. Of course, the authorities, they did not see it as art. They saw it as vandalism, period. By the 1980s, the mayor literally declared a war on graffiti. The city spent millions of dollars to scrub the trains clean, and artists, or writers, were getting arrested. But honestly, that crackdown just poured fuel on the fire and hardened the movement's rebellious spirit. And it's right in the middle of this tension, this conflict, that two absolute game changers emerge who would completely alter the conversation: Jean-Michel Basquiat and Keith Haring. These were the guys who started to build the bridge from the street to the gallery. And you can see just how different their approaches were. On one side, you had Basquiat, tagging as Samo. He wrote these sharp, poetic, critical phrases all over downtown, tackling huge themes like racism and the problem of fame. And on the other side, you have Keith Haring with his joyful, simple lines, his iconic radiant baby and barking dogs, spreading messages of love and crucial awareness about the AIDS crisis. Both use the city as their sketchbook, but in totally unique ways.
So this is the pivotal moment. This is the big question. How did art that was born on a dirty subway car end up in a clean, high-end art gallery? This was the great transition, the point where how people saw this entire art form began to radically shift.
And when you break it down, you can actually see the steps pretty clearly. It all starts with step one, that raw, rebellious energy from the streets. The established art world was secretly starving for something that authentic. Then comes step two. Artists like Basquiat and Haring start translating those street ideas onto canvas. That leads directly to step three. The work gets sold in upscale galleries. Suddenly, collectors could buy a piece of that downtown cool. And finally, that creates step four, a massive shift in perception. What was once a crime was now being celebrated as legitimate, important, and very, very valuable art.
And listen, this wasn't just a New York thing, not for long. What started in the Bronx quickly ignited a global art revolution. The movement went international, and it started to adapt and evolve in cities all over the planet.
I mean, just look at how fast this all happened. In the 80s, Basquiat and Haring are the breakthrough stars. Then boom, 1989, the Berlin Wall falls, and it instantly becomes this massive, symbolic canvas for artists. By the 90s, hip-hop tours are taking graffiti culture to every corner of the globe, and by the 2000s, you get the rise of Banksy, whose clever, political stencil art became a household name. And what's so cool is that in each new city, the art took on a local flavor. In Paris, an artist called Blek le Rat pioneered the use of stencils, a technique that would of course heavily influence Banksy later on. Meanwhile, over in Philadelphia, the city actually started paying artists for murals, flipping the script and turning graffiti into a source of community pride.
So that brings us to today, and the absolutely mind-blowing legacy of this whole movement. That journey from a criminal act to a commissioned work of art has resulted in a cultural and financial shift that nobody could have predicted.
It's almost hard to wrap your head around, but it's true. What started with a teenager and a can of spray paint in the Bronx is now a global, multi-billion-dollar industry. You've got artists, collectors, galleries, museums, everyone's involved. And if you need a single number to really understand that value, here it is. $110 million. That's what one single painting by Jean-Michel Basquiat, a guy who started out tagging walls as Samo, sold for at auction. At that point, the value was, well, undeniable. The institutional acceptance is now total. You've got museums in cities like Amsterdam and Berlin that are dedicated to street art. When Banksy secretly took over the Bristol Museum back in 2009, it proved this art form could walk into these elite spaces on its own terms. And now you see huge street art festivals celebrated everywhere, from Sao Paulo to Tokyo.
This quote, I think, just nails the enduring spirit of the whole thing. For the new generation of artists, street art is still this incredible tool. It's a superpower, really, the ability to take a boring, blank wall and turn it into a story that can bring people together, make them think, and inspire them. And so we end on a question, one that the art world itself is still wrestling with. When you take a piece of art from its home, the street, and you hang it in a gallery, does it fundamentally change what it is? If it's hanging in a museum, is it still street art? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks so much for watching.